Hey guys, so I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about something in particular that comes up frequently in debates between religious and non-religious people. In particular, it entered my mind recently when I rewatched a debate between Matt Dillahunty and Seitan Bruggencate, as well as a debate that Matt Dillahunty did with Matt Slick. And basically what's happening is this is being waged against naturalistic or non-theistic worldviews as an objection, philosophically speaking, to the integrity of those worldviews. However, the people throwing out this objection are being kind of naive about how deep this problem runs, and so I kind of wanted to talk about the inescapability of that. So the question here is basically addressing kind of the foundational level behind epistemology. Epistemology is the study of truth, how we have access to truth, and how we define truth. But basically, the question itself is, how do we know anything at all? And the answer is, unfortunately, we kind of don't in a kind of ultimate sense. Sticking with the two individuals I was talking about previously, the way Seitan Bruggencate usually approaches this is to kind of define it in one of the more common thought experiments. You have no way of proving that you're not a brain in a vat, and so how can you have any actual understanding of the external world? Matt Slick takes a slightly different approach where he says, on a naturalistic standpoint, the human brain and consciousness and thought and understanding and all of that is really just kind of a complex physical interaction of chemistry and physics, and so if you were to make a reductive comparison, that's very much like a baking soda and vinegar reaction, and if you put those two together and you get fizz, how do you say whether or not that fizz is true or false necessarily? So this has been under discussion for a very long time. In fact, René Descartes' most famous line ever, for which everyone, even those who don't delve into philosophy, are aware of, "I think, therefore I am," is actually a discussion of this issue. What we now call Cartesian skepticism, named after René Descartes, comes from this exercise that he illustrated, for which the idea was to surrender all beliefs and make yourself as much a blank slate as possible, and from there, what can we do to actually make a strong, justified view of reality? So step one would first be to establish the fact that we exist as a thinking agent. And so the idea that I think, therefore I am, expresses the fact that we have an incorrigible awareness of the existence of ourselves. And unfortunately, for the issue that we're discussing now, the second step involves making an assumption for which there is no possible justification. So the second part of building this consistent worldview would involve acknowledging the fact that we appear to be in some sort of an external reality, and not only assuming that that reality exists, but also that the sensory information that we're getting about that reality is at least partially accurate in conveying information to us. And this is where all of the different thought experiments that address this problem of hard solipsism come from. So for those of you who maybe haven't seen the movie The Matrix, this is a pretty good illustration of one of the thought experiments here. The main character of the movie is an individual very much like us who is experiencing an external world that, for all intents and purposes, is exactly identical to the one that we experience. However, the plot of the movie is that he is actually in a computer simulation and is unable to be aware of that until someone on the actual external world unplugs him, and then it turns out that the individuals who are in the computer simulations are all being effectively held captive by machines and used as batteries. Now, the reason this is a big deal is because not only is it perfectly clear that the individuals who would be in that computer simulation would have no access to the information that would let them know of the fact that they were in that simulation, but even after being externally removed from that simulation and living in the actual world, all of the same problems exist, and the main character, Neo, could not, for example, know that the second reality that he was now experiencing was the actual reality. It could also be a computer simulation for which he would need an external source to remove him from, at which point, while he existed in the third reality, he could not know, for example, that maybe this third reality was also part of a computer simulation, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, many of you probably think that that thought experiment's a little bit outlandish and very, very sci-fi, and not to be taken seriously, but there's another version of pretty much the same argument that's quite a bit more mundane and for which I think we can relate better. Rather than imagining ourselves as an individual who is stuck in a computer simulation like in The Matrix, what if we imagine ourselves as a person who's suffering from some severe psychosis and is in an insane asylum, and rather than experiencing a computer simulation, we're experiencing a very, very elaborate set of auditory and visual hallucinations for which we've effectively constructed a fictitious world inside our own head that we experience through sensory information in very much the same way that we experience sensory information about our external world. If this were the case, then from the perspective of the individual, there's no way for them to know that the things that they're experiencing are hallucinations rather than an accurate representation of reality or a computer simulation like the Matrix or anything of that sort. In fact, we can draw a similar parallel to the problem of being unplugged from the Matrix, so to speak. Let's say the individual who's experiencing these hallucinations is chosen as a candidate for a clinical trial for an antipsychotic medication. And this medication is extremely effective. All of their hallucinations disappear in a week and stay gone. All of the fundamental limitations that prevented this person from recognizing the fact that their hallucinatory experiences were accurate representations of reality still hold true in the actual reality. So they have no way of knowing, for example, that they're still not hallucinating. Their hallucination could be, for example, that they were living in a world where they were experiencing hallucinations, were given antipsychotic medications, and then stopped having hallucinations, all as part of an experience of hallucinations. And this same sort of infinite recursive thing happens where you're being unplugged from one layer of reality and another layer of reality and so on to infinity. So hopefully by now it should be clear that this is a big problem for epistemology, and while it's been discussed for hundreds of years, there don't seem to be any obvious solutions to it. So how is it that these apologists propose to have solved this problem? They start with the presupposition that God exists, and that this God has some means of sort of direct lining information into our consciousness, such that we have an incorrigible awareness of the truth of it, very much like we have an incorrigible awareness of our own existence. Now, obviously, there's a huge problem here. Our conscious awareness of received information is very much by definition a sensory experience of the external world, and I think the easiest way to illustrate this is with another thought experiment. Let's imagine a hypothetical universe. Everything is effectively identical to our own universe. There is definitely a God, and that God has the same ability to kind of mainline information directly to our consciousness such that we're aware of it incorrigibly. But unlike the apologist suggested God for this universe, this is a malicious and intentionally deceitful God who gives us information that is exactly identical to the information that these apologists claim that they're getting in this life. And the reason this God does this is so that he can create human beings and allow them to live out their short lifespan under the comforting delusion that they are under the watch of a benevolent God, and that at the end of their lives they're going to ascend to a heaven-like place where they can experience joy and happiness forever. And he derives pleasure from waiting out this game and at the very end of their lives pulling them out of this reality, showing them that everything they ever believed was a delusion, the universe is essentially nihilistic, and destroying their hopes and dreams of ever having an infinite amount of happiness, and effectively deriving pleasure from causing this severe acute psychological pain. From the perspective of the individuals living in this universe, how can they discern the difference between receiving deceitful information from a malicious and deceitful God versus an actually benevolent God? The truth is, this is an exact analogy for the problems that we talked about previously. There is no way for the individual who is subjectively experiencing both of these receipts of information to distinguish between the two. Hopefully this helps illustrate how inescapable this problem is and how naive the objections to it are. I want to close by saying that I'm not trying to suggest that this is the case, even if we were to go out on a limb and make the assumption that this were true for the sake of argument and say that we are in the Matrix. Our only meaningful interaction with our external reality is our subjective experience of it. So even if the reality we're experiencing is fictitious in the case of the mental patient, for example, or is a narrow subset of reality, as would be the case with a computer simulation, for example, pragmatically speaking, our only useful beliefs are those which pertain to the reality we experience anyway, and so we need to make the assumption that the universe that we experience is the actual universe in which we inhabit, and everything else is effectively extraneous on the back end of that. The reason I think this is an important thing for us to think about is because it reminds us that we have a fundamental inability to achieve absolute knowledge of anything. I run into people very, very frequently who are very, very convinced of a topic to the point where if you ask them, could you be wrong about that, the answer is no. There is no evidence you could ever show me that would tell me that God isn't real, or you could never prove to me that genetically modified organisms are safe. And what I want this to communicate to people is that we need to have intellectual humility. Our beliefs need to be based on the best evidence available, but we always need to remember that there is some non-zero probability that we're wrong about everything, and to constantly be assessing new evidence as it comes in, to refine and hone our beliefs about reality as much as possible, so that even within the confines of our complete deprivation of 100% absolute knowledge of information, we can have the best beliefs possible. See you guys in the next video.